Right now, if you called someone standing on Mars, their reply would reach you 44 minutes after you spoke. Not 44 seconds, 44 minutes. Long enough to cook a meal, drive across town, and lose the thread of the conversation entirely. That is the part people tend to talk about. The silence. The 1005 days sealed away from Earth. A span that breaks apart into roughly 198 days of transit out, 558 days walking the Martian surface, and 197 days of the long fall home. But the silence is not the problem. Launch windows to Mars open only once every 26 months, governed by the slow arithmetic of two planets circling the Sun at different speeds. If a crew leaves Earth and something goes wrong, no rescue is possible until that window opens again, more than 2 years later. And even in the best stretches of the journey, a single message and its answer averages around 24 to 26 minutes round trip. Every question you ask arrives already old. Every answer you receive is a report from a past that has already moved on. Yet the distance and the delay are not what change a person. Something quieter does. NASA data shows cognitive performance still declining months after astronauts return from missions far shorter than a Mars round trip. Brain scans taken after just 6 months in orbit reveal structural changes, shifts in the brain's white matter, and a redistribution of the fluid that bathes it, that only partially reverse in the year that follows. And those were missions less than a fifth the length of what Mars actually demands. Here is what most people get wrong. The journey to Mars is not at its heart a story about rockets, or radiation, or the terrible thin cold of another world. It is a story about what happens inside a single human mind that spends nearly 3 years on the far side of a silence no one has ever crossed before. The people who come back will not be the people who left. They will have spent almost 3 years becoming strangers. Strangers to Earth. Strangers to the ones who waited for them. And strangest of all, strangers to themselves. This is what that transformation actually looks like. If you find a slow, careful walk through the strange science of the human mind soothing, the kind of thing that lets a crowded head finally go quiet, do me a small favor and tap the like button, and think about subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel keep growing, and it lets me keep making these long, unhurried journeys for you. So make yourself warm and comfortable, turn the lights down low, and let your breathing slow. Let's begin. To understand how a person becomes a stranger, you have to begin long before Mars, with the most closely studied human body ever to leave this planet for an extended stay. His name is Scott Kelly. In March of the year 2015, he rose off the Earth aboard a Russian spacecraft and climbed toward the International Space Station, beginning what would become 340 days in orbit. That is not quite a year. It is roughly a third of a single Mars mission, and only a fraction of the time a crew would spend truly cut off from home. And yet what happened to Scott Kelly in that time, and more importantly what happened to him after he came back down, would quietly rewrite what we thought we knew about the human body in space. He did not go alone in the way that matters most to science. He left behind, standing on the ground, a man with the same face, the same voice, and very nearly the same set of genes. A twin brother named Mark, an astronaut himself, who would stay on Earth and live an ordinary Earthbound year while Scott circled overhead. 2 nearly identical human beings, separated for the first time by an environment that one of them was built for and the other was not. And when they were finally measured against each other, the results were not what anyone expected. They were not what anyone expected, and yet they were quieter than the headlines made them sound. When NASA published the findings of what it called the Twins study, in the pages of the journal Science, in the spring of 2019, the remarkable thing was not that Scott Kelly had come home broken. He had not. The remarkable thing was how much of him had changed while nobody, not the doctors and not Scott himself, could feel the change taking place. Deep inside his cells, the very way his genes were switching on and off had shifted during his time above the world. Not the genes themselves. The instructions were still written exactly as before, but the pattern of which instructions were being read, and how loudly each one was being spoken, had rearranged itself in orbit. When he came back down, most of that rearrangement settled again. Roughly 91% of the changes in how his genes were expressing themselves drifted back toward the baseline he had left with, back toward the pattern he still shared with the brother who had stayed on the ground. That sounds like recovery. It sounds like a body correcting itself, like water returning to level after a stone is lifted out of it. But recovery was not the whole story. A small remainder of those changes did not come back. Months after his feet had touched the earth again, a stubborn fraction was still altered, and it was not a random fraction. It had settled into exactly the systems you would least want it to disturb. The genes that lingered in this changed state were the ones that repair damage to the genetic code, the ones that regulate the protective caps on the ends of our chromosomes, and the ones that command the immune system. Not the cosmetic machinery of the body. The foundational machinery, the parts responsible for keeping the genetic text intact, for measuring the cell's own aging, and for defending the body against everything in the world that would harm it. In one man, after less than a single year away, a lasting edit had been written into some of the most carefully guarded passages in all of human biology. And then there was the mind, which unsettled the researchers most of all, because it refused to behave the way they had expected. Throughout all 340 days aboard the station, Scott Kelly's mental performance held. His speed, his accuracy, his ability to think clearly under pressure, all of it stayed roughly where it had always been. The decline did not arrive in space. It arrived after he landed. In the weeks and the months that followed his return, his cognitive speed and his accuracy dropped in measurable ways, and the drop did not lift overnight. It lingered for the better part of half a year. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Muscle wastes away in space, and then it comes back. Bone grows thin in orbit, and given enough time under gravity, it slowly rebuilds itself. The body carries ancient routines for repairing these particular insults, because gravity has always been present, and the body has always known how to bargain with it. The brain did not follow that script. It did not weaken during the ordeal and then heal once the ordeal was over. It weakened after the ordeal had ended, once the danger was supposedly behind him, and it stayed weakened long after the muscle and the bone had begun their patient return. The last part of Scott Kelly to come home was not his legs, it was his mind. Now hold that image steady and remember the proportion of it. 340 days, a third of a Mars mission at the very most. One man, in low orbit, close enough to trace the coastlines of the continents beneath him, close enough that a word from home reached him almost the instant it was spoken. This is a study of a single number, the number of days a human being spends removed from the world that made them. And like every number worth studying, it has a history. To read that history properly, and to understand why the people who travel to Mars may not return as the people who departed, we have to stop looking upward for a while. We have to look down instead, at the coldest and loneliest places on our own planet, where human beings first discovered that isolation is not merely uncomfortable, it rewrites the person who endures it. For that lesson, we go to Antarctica. Long before anyone had flown to a space station, small crews of scientists were sealing themselves inside research bases at the bottom of the world to wait out the polar winter. Months of unbroken darkness. No flights arriving, no flights leaving. The same few faces around the same small table, one identical night after another. As far back as 1973, researchers studying these winter-over crews gave a name to what they kept seeing happen to the human beings inside those stations. They called it winter-over syndrome. It was not a single dramatic collapse. It was a slow gathering of small erosions. Depression that settled in like the cold outside. Insomnia that stole the nights one by one. Irritability that wore down the smallest exchanges. And a creeping difficulty with memory and concentration that made ordinary thought feel like wading through deep snow. There was one symptom that seemed to hold all the others inside it. captured in a single image. The crews began to describe a certain look that came over people who had been down there too long. A person would drift into a kind of waking absence, eyes open and fixed on nothing, present in the room, and yet somehow no longer inside it. They called it the Antarctic stare. Some called it long eye. It was not sleep, and it was not quite daydreaming. It was the mind, worn thin by sameness and separation, quietly stepping out of a moment that had stopped offering it anything new. And here is the detail that matters most for the journey ahead of us. Antarctica is the closest thing on this planet to the psychological conditions of a voyage to Mars. It is the rehearsal stage, the dress rehearsal for the real thing. And even there, with rescue only a season away and the familiar sky still stretched overhead, the human mind begins to come apart in predictable, nameable ways. Much of that unraveling begins, as it so often does, with sleep. And sleep turns out to be among the first things that space quietly takes away. Consider what we have already learned from the astronauts who have actually lived above the Earth for months at a stretch. Aboard the International Space Station, crew members averaged only a little more than 6 hours of sleep each night, 6.09 hours to be exact, well short of the rest that a demanding body and an overworked mind actually require. And that average, gentle as it sounds, hides the sharper truth beneath it. On nearly half of all the nights spent in orbit, on 47.1% of them, astronauts slept for fewer than 6 hours. On the nights before a spacewalk, when the coming day would ask everything of them, more than half of those nights fell below 6 hours as well. To carry that burden, they reached for help. Somewhere between 75 and 78% of the astronauts aboard the station used medication of some kind to help themselves fall asleep. To translate that into human terms, that is roughly 6 times the rate at which people down on the ground reach for the same relief, where the figure sits closer to 12%. And the need was not spread evenly across the mission. On the nights when the body's internal clock had drifted out of step with the schedule it was ordered to keep, the use of sleeping medication climbed toward 1 in 4 to 24%, against only 11% on the nights when the clock and the schedule happened to agree. But the amount of sleep lost was only part of what was taken. The quality of it changed too, and it changed in the deepest and most important place. The dreaming phase of sleep, the rapid eye movement stage in which the brain does much of its emotional housekeeping, was cut roughly in half during spaceflight compared with what those same astronauts had known on the ground. Not trimmed by a small margin, nearly halved. The one nightly process the brain relies upon to file away the events of the day, to soften the hardest memories and quietly make sense of what has happened, was running at half its strength, night after night, for month after month. Imagine a person kept for years in a room where every night the mind is allowed only half of its usual chance to heal itself, and you begin to see the shape of the problem forming. And remember, these were the fortunate ones. These were astronauts still circling their home world, still able to press their face to a window and find the Earth turning below them, still bathed in the reassurance of a planet they could see. To learn what happens when you take that window away, when you seal human beings inside a sealed box and tell them they are bound for Mars and will not step outside for the better part of 2 years, we have to leave orbit behind entirely. We have to travel to a windowless facility on the outskirts of Moscow, to a mission that never left the ground and yet took 6 people further from ordinary human experience than almost anyone before them. The project was called Mars 500, and the name was itself a kind of promise about time. 520 days sealed inside a cluster of windowless steel modules parked in a research institute in Moscow. No view of the outside world, no door that would open early. 6 men volunteered for it, 3 from Russia, 1 from France, 1 from Italy, and 1 from China. They were not launched into space, they were sent nowhere at all, and that absence of anywhere was precisely the point. The experiment concluded in November of 2011, and by every outward measure it was a triumph. The crew survived, the modules held, the mission ran its full length, and the men stepped out into a daylight they had not touched in a year and a half. But the question that mattered was never whether they would survive. It was what the confinement did to the quiet machinery of their minds, slowly and invisibly, in ways no medical scan taken on the first day could have foreseen. The body endured. The self did not come through unchanged. Consider the crew member the researchers recorded only as B, sealed away from sunrise and sunset, cut off from the vast external clock that every human body silently obeys. His internal rhythm began to drift. His days stopped matching the calendar on the wall. His body settled into a cycle of roughly 25 hours, waking and sleeping on a schedule that belonged to no planet at all, sliding a little further out of step with his crewmates every week. He was awake while they slept. He slept while they worked. Not because he had chosen to withdraw, but because the timekeeper buried deep inside his brain had quietly stopped listening to the world around it. Imagine living in a house where your own clocks run slow, so that each morning you wake a little later than everyone you love, until eventually you are eating breakfast as they sit down to dinner, present in the same rooms yet permanently a few hours adrift. This is not a trivial inconvenience. The rhythm of sleeping and waking is one of the deepest agreements a person keeps with the people around them, an unspoken synchrony that lets us share meals, share silences, share the ordinary hours of a single day. When that synchrony quietly dissolves, a person can be physically present and yet socially absent, awake in a sleeping world, alone in a crowded room. B was not far from his crewmates. He was a few feet away, through a thin wall, and still, night after night, he was slipping into a private country of his own hours, a place none of the others could follow him into. It is a small preview of a larger truth this entire story keeps circling toward. The distance that turns a person into a stranger is not always measured in miles. Then there was the crewman labelled F. Across the long months, the researchers measured his attention with a simple and merciless test, a task that asks a person only to stay alert and respond the instant a signal appears at unpredictable moments. It sounds almost trivial. It is in fact one of the most sensitive instruments we possess for detecting a mind worn thin by fatigue and monotony. F accounted for nearly 2/3 of all the moments when a crew member simply failed to respond at all, and for almost half of the moments when someone answered before the signal had even arrived. His attention was not merely tired, it was fraying at both ends at once, missing what was truly there and reacting to what was not. And there was the man known only as E, whose voyage was measured not in errors but in mood. For the overwhelming majority of the weeks he spent inside that sealed box, more than 9 weeks out of every 10, the instruments built to track his emotional state registered the unmistakable signature of depression. Not a passing bad day, not the ordinary low that visits every human life, a persistent structural heaviness that coloured almost the entire length of his artificial journey. He had travelled precisely nowhere, and yet something inside him had gone very far away and shown no hurry to return. What emerged from Mars 500 was stranger than fatigue or low spirits alone. When the researchers tallied the conflicts, the friction, the moments of tension and frustration across those 520 days, they discovered that the crew rarely turned on one another. The men in the box, thrown together with no possibility of escape, largely held together. The tension instead flowed outward, toward the single fragile connection they still had to the world they had left behind. Conflict between the crew and their mission control occurred roughly 5 times more often than conflict among the crew themselves. The thing that frayed first was not the bond between the travellers, it was the thread that tied them back to home. This pattern carries a name, borrowed from an older and colder body of research. Long before anyone sealed volunteers inside a counterfeit spaceship, scientists studying the crews who wintered over at remote Antarctic stations had noticed something in the shape of confinement itself. As early as 1973, they described a dip that arrives not at the beginning of an isolation, when everything is fresh and demanding, and not at the very end when release is finally in sight, but somewhere in the third quarter of the ordeal. Mood sinks. People speak to one another less, cohesion thins and performance quietly slips. And it happens at the precise moment you would least expect it, after the hardest adjustment is behind, and before the reward of return has come into view. The mind, it turns out, does not measure suffering by how difficult a given moment is. It measures suffering by how much longer that moment must still be borne. The Antarctic winter remains the closest rehearsal our planet can offer for a voyage to Mars, and what it exposes is a specific and repeatable constellation of change. Those who endure the long polar night report depression and broken sleep, an irritability that flares over nothing, a memory that turns slippery, and a concentration that will no longer hold its grip. And they report something stranger still, a mild and drifting and faraway state that the people who have lived through it call the Antarctic stare, or simply long eye. It is the expression of a mind that has been left alone with itself for far too long. It is not madness. It is something quieter and more lasting than that, a kind of interior weather that settles in and does not fully lift even when the sun climbs back over the horizon. Gather these threads together and a picture forms that is difficult to look away from. A drifting clock, an attention that misses and misfires, a mood that sinks and will not rise, a widening rift with the very people meant to keep you tethered, a predictable collapse in the middle of the long dark, and a stare that outlasts the darkness itself. Each of these was observed in isolation, in one crew, or one program, or one frozen station at the bottom of the world. A journey to Mars would not deliver them one at a time. It would deliver them all together, to the same people inside the same sealed volume, for far longer than any of these rehearsals ever ran. And here is the fact that ought to stop us where we stand. Every one of these findings, the drifting clock, the collapsing attention, the depression that fills 9 weeks in 10, the friction with home, the third quarter descent, the long polar stare, was gathered from people who never once left the Earth. Mars 500 was only a simulation, and its door could have opened in a genuine emergency. The Antarctic cruise, however remote, could still in principle be reached. The astronauts orbiting overhead could always look down and find their home world turning beneath them. A true crossing to Mars withholds every one of these mercies. It lasts not 500 days, but more than 1,000. It carries the traveller not to Moscow or to an icy plateau, but tens of millions of miles from every other beating human heart. And it works its slow changes upon the single organ we have only just begun to understand. Because beneath the drifting sleep and the sinking mood, something far more physical is taking place. Something written not merely into behaviour, but into the living tissue of the brain itself. To see it clearly, we have to stop watching how these people act, and begin looking directly at what the journey does to the matter inside their skulls. The matter inside the skull was never as fixed as we imagine it. We carry a picture of the brain as the most sheltered thing we own, sealed inside bone, suspended in fluid, held apart from the ordinary wear that touches everything else in the body. For an entire life lived on the ground, that picture is close enough to true. But the instant a human being rises off the planet, the brain begins to move. It does not move quickly. It does not announce itself. It drifts, slowly, upward and inward, in ways so small that only the most sensitive instruments ever built can find them. For a long time, that drift was simply invisible. Then the machines improved. When astronauts started coming home from 6-month tours aboard the International Space Station, researchers began sliding them into magnetic resonance scanners within hours of landing, before the body had any chance to forget where it had been. The images that returned were quiet and grey and deeply unsettling. The brains in those pictures had changed shape, not in some vague impressionistic way, in measurable fractions, written into the tissue itself. The clearest change appeared in the white matter, the dense wiring that runs beneath the folded surface of the brain, the cabling along which every thought and instruction travels. Across many regions of that wiring, the microscopic architecture had shifted by somewhere between 0.75% and 1.25%. Said aloud, that sounds like almost nothing, a sliver, a rounding error. But a number means nothing until you set it beside the right comparison. Set it beside the ordinary aging of a brain sitting still on Earth, and its whole character changes. This was roughly twice the pace of normal aging. 6 months above the planet had weathered the wiring of the brain the way a full year of life might, and in some regions more. The concern was not the size of the change, but its direction. The brain was not adapting towards something better. It was moving, structurally, toward the condition of an older brain, and doing it in half the expected time. And this was only the first thing the scanners found. At the very center of the brain sit a set of hollow chambers filled with cerebrospinal fluid, called the ventricles. In the returning astronauts, those chambers had swollen. They had expanded by more than 3/4 of a milliliter. That is a volume you could balance on the tip of a finger and barely notice. It is also a volume that, inside the sealed vault of the skull, has nowhere free to go. Every fraction of a milliliter the ventricles gain, some neighboring tissue has to surrender. The fluid was not simply increasing, it was redistributing, pressing outward against structures that had spent a lifetime in a fixed and gentle balance. The scans traced that redistribution across the brain as a whole. In the frontal, the temporal and the occipital lobes, the seats of reasoning, of memory and of vision, the amount of free water had shifted by 2.5 to 4%. This is the fluid that bathes and permeates living tissue. And here on the ground, gravity keeps it patiently pulled toward the feet, drawn downward through the whole body, including, in its own subtle way, within the head. Take gravity away, and the fluid climbs. It rises into the skull and settles and stays. There is no equivalent to this anywhere in ordinary human life. Not a fever, not a head cold, not standing on your head, not the deepest sleep. No illness and no posture on Earth reproduces it. It is a state that belongs to the act of leaving the ground, and to nothing else. Consider what this means for the person lying inside that scanner. The regions the changes struck hardest were not scattered at random. They gathered, with a kind of grim precision, in exactly the parts of the brain whose one job is to keep a body oriented in the world. One was a great bundle of fibers that helps process, balance and track the body through space. Another was the pathway that carries the brain's commands down to the muscles. Another sat in the stalks of the cerebellum, the brain's dedicated instrument of balance. And another lay in the parietal region, the home of proprioception, the quiet sense that tells you where your own hand is in the dark, without your ever having to look. These were the circuits the journey rewired, not the abstract centers of thought, but the machinery of standing, walking and knowing which way is up. The consequence showed itself the moment these astronauts tried to move. Measurable deficits in balance appeared within 2 days of landing. When Scott Kelly took his first steps back onto solid Earth, he stumbled into a planter set beside his own path. He had walked that ground 1,000 times. His legs knew every foot of it, but the part of his brain that was supposed to tell him where the floor sat had spent a year learning a different and terrible lesson, that there was no floor, that down was a direction without meaning, that a body simply hangs in place. It was not his legs that failed him on that third step home. It was his vestibular system, the brain's inner sense of gravity, trying to remember a planet it had unlearned. This is the crushing intimacy of the problem. The changes are not happening to some distant instrument the traveller can set aside. They are happening to the very organ that does the travelling, the organ that will one day have to decide what any of this meant, and recovery when it comes is slow and only partial. Even 6 months to a full year after a mere 6-month flight, the scanners still found the ventricles enlarged, the wiring altered, the water not yet fully returned to where it belonged. The brain does drift back toward its old shape. It has simply never been shown to arrive. Sit with that for a moment. The brain is not a fixed map of who you are. It is a running negotiation with a particular world, its gravity, its horizon, its flaw, renewed silently in every waking second. Change the world, and the map changes with it. The astronauts who returned had not lost their memories or their names. They had lost, for a time, the effortless certainty of where their bodies ended and the ground began. And all of this was measured in people who had gone no farther than orbit, who had circled the Earth still wrapped in the outermost folds of its magnetic shield. Mars offers no such shelter. Beyond the reach of that shield waits a force the 6-month studies never had to reckon with, and it does not merely shift the brain's fluid from one chamber to another, it reaches into the tissue and rewrites it, one particle at a time. The force is called galactic cosmic radiation, and it is unlike anything that governs a life on the ground. These are the bare nuclei of atoms, stripped of their electrons and flung across the galaxy by ancient exploding stars, moving so close to the speed of light that no ordinary wall can stop them. They pass through metal, they pass through the hull of a spacecraft, they pass through a human skull and the soft tissue behind it as though it were open air, and every so often one of them strikes a living cell dead center. On the surface of the Earth, our atmosphere and our magnetic field absorb almost all of this. A crew bound for Mars would absorb it directly, at a rate of roughly 350 millisieverts each year, for the length of a journey measured not in weeks, but in years. We cannot ethically expose a human brain to that and watch what happens. So the work has been done, carefully and disturbingly, on animals. In 2015, a research team led by a scientist named Parihar exposed rodents to a laboratory version of this same cosmic radiation, and then waited, and then tested what remained. The results did not fade the way a bruise fades. Months later, the animals still carried the damage. Their hippocampus, the brain's structure for spatial and recognition memory, the part that lets a creature know where it is and what it has seen before, was measurably impaired. The medial prefrontal cortex, the seat of planning and self-control, no longer worked as it had. The animals had lost some of their ability to unlearn fear, and they carried an elevated anxiety that lingered for 12 to 24 weeks after a single exposure. Translate those weeks into the scale of a creature that lives only a few short years, and the proportion turns staggering. For the mouse, this was not a passing fog. It was a meaningful share of its entire remaining life spent carrying a damaged mind. And the dose that produced it was only a fraction of what a human crew would gather across the long crossing to Mars and back again. There is a plain word for what this radiation does to the fine branching structure of a brain cell. It prunes it. The delicate arms that neurons extend to speak to one another are thinned and shortened, and the tiny junctions between them grow sparse. A brain is, in the most literal sense, its connections. Thin them, and you have not injured the person in some peripheral recoverable way. You have quietly begun to erase the very paths along which that person exists at all. So what would nearly 3 years of this do to a human being? The honest answer is that nobody knows. No human brain has ever been held in it for that long, and no ethical experiment ever will be. We have the orbit studies which measured the fluid and the wiring. We have the animal studies which measured the memory and the fear. What we do not yet have is the one measurement that would matter most. A human mind that has made the full crossing and come home to be understood. Consider what that gap in our knowledge actually feels like from the inside, which is to say that it feels like nothing at all. Radiation does not announce itself. There is no ache when a neuron is trimmed back, no warning light, no sensation of a pathway going quiet. Not because the injury is trivial, but because the brain contains no sensors that report on its own structure. A person can lose measurable tissue across the front of the skull and feel, from within, entirely and reassuringly like themselves. That is the strangest cruelty of this particular mechanism. The thing being altered is the very thing that would have to notice the alteration. It cannot stand outside itself to check. And the change, when the scanners finally find it, is not scattered at random through the tissue. It settles into specific cables. There is a long rope of white matter that runs front to back along each side of the head, and its work is to keep track of where you are in space, whether you are upright, whether the ground beneath you is level. There is another bundle that carries the command to move, translating a thought about lifting your arm into the actual lifting. There are the narrow stalks that feed the balance organ its stream of information. And there are the regions near the crown of the head that build, moment by moment and without any effort on your part, a living map of where your own hands and feet are in the dark. These are not abstractions on a diagram. They are the machinery of standing in a doorway and knowing, without looking down, that you will not fall. This is why the astronaut who has been measured and scanned and studied still reaches for a handrail that is not there. Within 2 days of coming home, that measured wiring produces a measured failure. The floor seems to tilt. The head feels a half beat behind the body. Down has to be relearned like a language half forgotten. Not because the muscles have weakened, though they have, but because the part of the brain that decides which way is down has quietly rewritten itself around a world that had no down at all. For 6 months in orbit, up was simply wherever the head happened to point. The brain, being an obedient organ, believed it completely. It reshaped its own map to match a lie the body was telling it, and that new map does not dissolve the instant weight returns. The rest of the body, given time, argues its way back to Earth. Bone slowly remineralizes, muscle rebuilds under load, but the brain follows a stranger and slower schedule, and it does not fully return. When astronauts are scanned again at 6 months, and again at a full year after landing, the swelling of the fluid spaces and the strain in the white matter have eased, but only part way. The measurements come down. They do not come all the way home. A residue remains, small and persistent, a faint watermark that the environment has pressed into the tissue. Not a scar anyone could point to, not a disability anyone would diagnose. Just a quiet distance between the brain that left and the brain that came back, still faintly visible on the film a year later. Here is the sentence that should make you sit still with the whole of this. Every number we have described, the fluid that shifts, the wiring that thins, the balance that fails and only half recovers, comes from missions of roughly 6 months. 6 months is the ruler we have. 6 months is the deepest that any careful, repeated human measurement has ever been able to reach into this problem. A voyage to Mars and back is nearly 3 years. It is that same short ruler laid down end to end, more than 5 times over, reaching out into territory where the ruler simply runs out. We do not know whether the residue grows in proportion, or faster than proportion, or whether somewhere past the edge of the data, the partial recovery stops being partial and quietly becomes permanent. Not because the question is uninteresting, but because there has never once been a body to ask it of. Picture the recovery curve we actually possess, that gentle upward line bending slowly back toward baseline across a year, and then notice the thing we tend to forget about it. We have only ever watched it begin. We have seen the first months of the climb. We have never seen where it levels off, or whether it levels off at all, for a mind that spent nearly 1,000 days away from the planet that grew it. The Mars crew would be the ones to draw the rest of that line, with their own recoveries, their own repeated scans, their own slow and stumbling reacquaintance with the simple fact of weight. They would not be studying the experiment. They would be the experiment. They would be the measurement that no ethics board on Earth could ever approve, and that the mission itself carries out anyway, quietly and inevitably, simply by leaving the ground. And it is worth being honest about what the word crossing means here, because it is not only a crossing of distance, it is a crossing of conditions the human nervous system was never built to survive intact. On Earth, gravity holds the fluids of the head in a familiar arrangement. The balance organs are fed a steady true signal, and the sky above filters away the worst of what the galaxy is throwing at us. Strip those 3 protections away at once, for years, and you have placed the most complicated object we know of into a setting it has no evolutionary answer for. The brain does not shut down, it adapts. But adaptation is just another word for change, and a brain that has changed to thrive in that place is, by definition, a brain less suited to this one. So the person who steps off that returning ship will look identical to the person who boarded it. The same face, the same voice, the same name answered to across a lifetime, but somewhere beneath the familiar surface, in the fluid spaces and the frayed fibers and the fine branching arms of billions of cells, a slow rewriting will have taken place, authored entirely by an environment the human brain was never shaped to enter. the change will be real. It will be measurable, at least in part, by machines that see what no eye can. And it will be, in the most literal sense, invisible to everyone standing on the tarmac to welcome them, including the traveller who carries it inside their own head and feels perfectly ordinarily like themselves. This is only the machinery of it. This is only what the scanner sees, the physical residue, the wiring and the water and the trimmed connections. What the mind does with 3 years of that same isolation, 3 years of an alien clock and an unreachable earth and a silence too wide to talk across, is a second and far deeper kind of alteration, and it does not wait for the landing. It begins the very moment the door seals shut. Consider what that sealed door actually is. It is not a hatch closing on a vehicle. It is the closing of a boundary around a mind, a line drawn between a human being and every rhythm, every face, every reassurance that shaped them into who they are. For the entire span of the journey, that boundary will not open. And inside it, the first thing to come apart is something so quiet that most of us never notice we depend on it at all. It is time itself, not the time printed on a clock, but the deeper time the body keeps, the ancient internal rhythm that tells a nervous system when to wake, when to sleep, when to feel alert, and when to let go. Every human being carries a clock buried deep in the brain, in a small cluster of cells sitting just above the point where the optic nerves cross. This is the master pacemaker, and left entirely to itself, with no sunrise to correct it, it does not run on a clean 24-hour day. It runs, on average, on a day of about 24.18 hours. On Earth this barely matters. Each morning the light resets the drift, nudging the clock back into step with the turning of the planet, and the mismatch dissolves before it can gather into anything. We live our whole lives inside a correction we never feel being made. Take that correction away, and the clock begins to wander. To understand what a wandering clock does to a mind, we do not have to guess. We have already run the experiment, on the ground, in a sealed steel chamber on the outskirts of Moscow. The study was called Mars 500, and it remains the longest and most complete rehearsal of an isolated Mars journey ever attempted. 6 volunteers, 3 of them Russian, 1 French, 1 Italian, and 1 Chinese, agreed to be locked inside a mock spacecraft for 520 days, the approximate length of a fuel-efficient round trip to Mars and back. They did not go anywhere. That was precisely the point. The distance was simulated, the isolation was real. Their messages to the outside world were deliberately delayed to mimic the lag of deep space, and the door stayed shut through the seasons, from 1 year into the next, closing in the summer and opening again in the autumn of 2011. For the first months, the 6 held together. Then, somewhere in the long middle of the mission, the crew began, quietly to diverge, and the clearest sign of it was not an argument and not a breakdown. It was a sleep schedule. One crew member, identified in the published findings only as crew member B, stopped keeping the same hours as everyone else. His internal clock had slipped its mooring and begun to free run, cycling on a day close to 25 hours long. Day by day his rhythm drifted later, then later still, until he was awake while the others slept and asleep while they worked. By the deepest part of the mission, somewhere near the 400th day inside that chamber, he was living, in effect, on a different planet from the 5 men breathing the same recycled air a few feet away. Now, here is the detail that turns a laboratory curiosity into a warning. Mars does not turn on a 24-hour day. A single Martian day, what mission planners call a sol, lasts 24 hours and 39 minutes. That extra 39 minutes sounds trivial, the kind of small surplus you could sleep off in a single lazy morning. It is not trivial. It is almost exactly the wandering, uncorrected rhythm that the human clock falls into on its own once it is cut off from the light of Earth. The intrinsic human day of roughly 24.18 hours and the Martian sol of 24.65 hours are close cousins. Both are longer than the world we evolved on. Neither one matches it. Consider what this means for a body placed on that surface. If you set a human being down on Mars and let them keep their own time, the planet's slightly longer day and the brain's slightly longer clock would pull in nearly the same direction, and that person would drift, night after night, deeper into a schedule no home on Earth could ever share. The danger is not that Mars time is hard. The danger is that Mars time is close enough to fool the body and wrong enough to never let it settle. Not a rhythm the astronaut fights and wins, a rhythm that never lets the fight resolve. And we already know what that feels like, because a group of ordinary people on Earth have lived it. In the year 2008, NASA landed a spacecraft called Phoenix near the northern pole of Mars, and for 78 days the roughly 150 people running that mission from an operations center in Tucson, Arizona, chose to live on Martian time. They did it to stay in step with the lander, whose every working day began 39 minutes later than the last. Within weeks, the effect on them was impossible to miss. Among the workers studied most closely, nearly 2 out of 3 reported that their fatigue had strongly or moderately increased. Among the wider support staff, 3 out of 4 reported growing exhaustion, sleepiness, and irritability. Engineers found themselves sleeping through California afternoons and sitting down to breakfast at midnight, their bodies sliding a little further out of step with the sun with each passing day. One account described it plainly as a kind of jet lag no human being had ever experienced before. Here is the part worth sitting with. Those people went home. Every evening, or every strange sliding version of an evening, they walked out of the operations center into ordinary Arizona sunlight, drove past familiar streets, and slept beside people who still lived on normal time. They kept 1 foot on Mars and 1 foot planted firmly on Earth, and even that half measure was enough to leave 3 out of 4 of them worn down and short-tempered within a matter of weeks. Now take the Earth foot away entirely. Take away the sunlight, the drive home, the partner sleeping beside them on ordinary hours. Stretch 78 days into more than 1,000. That is not a harder version of the Phoenix experience. It is a different thing altogether, a total immersion in an alien clock with no shore to return to when the shift ends. But crew member B and his loosened clock were only the most visible edge of something larger moving through that sealed chamber. A drifting sleep schedule can be plotted on a chart. What was happening underneath, to the crew's attention and their moods, was harder to see, and in the end more troubling. Deep in the same mission, a different volunteer, recorded in the findings only as crew member F, quietly became the source of most of the crew's lapses in sustained attention. On a standard test of vigilance, a simple task that measures how reliably a person can stay alert and respond to a signal, this one man accounted for 64% of all the moments when a response should have come and never did, and for 48% of the false starts, the responses that fired too early, at nothing at all. One person, drifting, carrying the clear majority of an entire crew's failures of attention, and a third member, crew member E, showed the measurable signs of depression in 93% of the weeks the mission lasted. Not a bad stretch, not a rough patch through the middle, almost the entire journey, shadowed from nearly beginning to nearly end. These were not weak or unqualified people. They were screened, selected, motivated volunteers who knew a door would open again on a fixed date, who could count down the days to a Moscow autumn that was never in any real doubt. And still the isolation reached into them and moved things. It slowed one man's attention. It dimmed another's mood. It set a third adrift on a clock all his own. There is even a name for the shape this kind of decline tends to take, and it did not come from space at all. It came from the ice. In 1973, researchers studying the crews who wintered over through the long darkness of Antarctica noticed a strange and consistent pattern in how people came apart under confinement. The lowest point did not arrive at the beginning, when the isolation was new and raw. It did not arrive at the very end, when release was close and spirits might be expected to sag. It clustered, instead, a little past the midpoint, in the third quarter of the ordeal, in the long stretch after the novelty has fully worn away and before the finish line has come into view. Mood dips. Cohesion frays. People speak to one another less. Small tasks slip. They called it the third quarter phenomenon, and it has surfaced again and again in every environment where humans are sealed away from the world for long enough to lose the shape of ordinary time. Mars 500 found it too. As that simulated mission crossed out of its first half and pushed into its third and fourth quarters, the crew's own scores on a standard measure of mood recorded a rise in confusion and bewilderment, a clouding of the inner weather that thickened in exactly the stretch the Antarctic winterers had warned of half a century before, and the crew of Mars 500 were never more than a locked door away from home. They breathed real air, under a roof, on a planet where a rescue was always a corridor away. The people who actually make the crossing to Mars will carry that same third quarter weight in the same long middle of the same kind of confinement. Except their third quarter will not unfold behind a door in Moscow. It will unfold on the surface of another world, or inside the sealed hull of a ship, crossing the emptiness between two planets, with no corridor, no door, and no home waiting on the other side of it. And even inside their comfortable simulation, the 6 people of Mars 500 did not bend as a single unit. They bent as individuals, each in his own private way. It is in those private differences that the escalation becomes personal. Consider the crew member the researchers simply labelled B. Somewhere in the long middle of that 520-day confinement, B's internal clock quietly let go of the external day. His body stopped keeping time with the schedule around him and began running on its own rhythm, a cycle of roughly 25 hours, drifting a little later with each rotation, his sleep sliding forward hour by hour until his waking life and the mission's waking life no longer overlapped the way they had at the start. He was awake while the others slept. He slept while the others worked. Nothing forced this. No malfunction caused it. His nervous system, left without the strong daily pull of a real sunrise, simply reverted to its longer natural period and floated free of the group. This is called a free-running rhythm, and it is not a failure of discipline. It is what a human body does when you take away the sky. Then there was the crew member labelled F. Across the mission, the team was tested again and again on a simple, merciless task called the psychomotor vigilance test, a pure measure of sustained attention. A signal appears. You respond. The test does not care how clever you are. It cares only whether you are still there, and F, one man among 6, was responsible for 64% of all the errors of omission the entire crew committed. The moments when the signal came and no response followed at all, the lapses where attention simply went dark. He accounted for 48% of the false starts as well, the jumps ahead of the signal. Not because he was careless, not because he had been chosen poorly, but because the long confinement had found the particular seam in this particular person and pulled at it, quietly, week after week, until one man carried nearly 2/3 of the crew's lapses in attention. And there was E. For 93% of the weeks of that mission, nearly every single week from beginning to end, E showed measurable symptoms of depression. Not a passing mood, not a bad stretch that lifted and moved on. A weight that settled early and stayed, present in almost every week the researchers thought to measure, in a healthy, screened, carefully selected volunteer who knew with complete certainty that the real Earth waited a short walk beyond the wall. 3 people. 3 different fault lines. One drifted out of time. One lost his grip on attention. One sank slowly into a grief that had no external cause. And all of it happened inside a building in Moscow, where the air was real, the ground was solid, and rescue was never more than a decision away. This is the reality that should settle over you now. These were not the failures of a poorly chosen crew. This was the ordinary human response to being sealed away from the world, and it appeared in the safest possible version of the experiment. The people who actually make the crossing will meet these same fault lines in themselves, in a place where not one of those comforts applies, and Mars will not even let them keep Earth's clock. A day on Mars, One full turn of the planet from one sunrise to the next lasts 24 hours and roughly 39 minutes. It is called a sol, and it runs about 24.65 hours long. That extra half hour and a little more sounds almost trivial, the kind of difference you would never notice across a single morning, that the human body keeps time with a master clock buried deep in the brain. And that clock has its own natural period, close to 24.18 hours. Under the ordinary light inside a habitat, that clock cannot stretch far enough to match the Martian day. It cannot entrain. The planet turns to one rhythm, and the body inside insists on another, and the gap between them widens a little with every passing sol. The crew will live on a world their own biology can never quite agree to. We already know what this does to people, because a small group of humans has already lived it, and they never left the Earth. In the summer of 2008, NASA landed the Phoenix probe near the northern plains of Mars, and to work that lander in step with the Martian day, roughly 150 members of the ground team in Tucson, Arizona, went on to Mars time. For 78 days they let their working lives drift by that extra 40 minutes each day, sleeping through California afternoons, eating breakfast at midnight, their schedules slowly rotating around the clock and away from everyone they loved. Among the ones studied closely, 64% reported that their fatigue had strongly or moderately increased. Among the wider support staff, 3 out of every 4 described rising fatigue, sleepiness, and irritability. One account of it called the result a kind of jet lag no human had ever experienced before. And remember what these people had. They drove home at the end of a shift. Their families were in the next room. They could step out into real sunlight whenever the mismatch grew too heavy to carry. The crew on Mars will have none of that relief, and they will live inside the mismatch, not for 78 days, but for the better part of 2 years. Now layer onto all of this one more thing, the quietest of them, and perhaps the most disturbing. In the year 2023, researchers published a study in which mice were exposed to a laboratory imitation of deep space radiation, a beam built from 33 different kinds of particles, assembled to stand in for the galactic cosmic rays that pour through interplanetary space without pause. The effects on the animals did not clear away when the exposure stopped. They showed lasting changes in cognitive function and lasting disruption in the chemical signaling of the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain that plans, decides, and restrains. From work of this kind, some researchers have offered a projection so stark that it is still being argued over today. It suggests that as many as 1 in 3 astronauts on a Mars mission could suffer serious impairment of their thinking. The figure is contested. It comes from animals, not from people, and no human being has yet made the crossing to prove it or disprove it. But it hangs there all the same, an unproven possibility that no one has been able to rule out. So gather the picture as it now stands, a clock that comes loose from the day, an attention that flickers and lapses, a mood that darkens and stays dark, a planet that refuses to keep time with the body, and beneath all of it, a steady rain of radiation that may be quietly reshaping the very organ doing the worrying. Each of these was measured in isolation, in one experiment or another, in volunteers or in animals, or in tired engineers who still got to go home. On Mars they will arrive together, in the same bodies, in the same sealed rooms, at the same time, with no way out and no way back for years. And still, this is not yet the heaviest part of it, because every one of these fractures is happening on the inside of a person. There is a second kind of distance, one that runs outward, across the black gulf between the crew and everyone they left behind. That distance does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, disguised as something small. A lag, a pause on the line, a silence just a little longer than a silence should be. When you speak to someone standing on the surface of Mars, your voice does not reach them when you finish speaking. It travels outward at the speed of light, which sounds instantaneous, and is the fastest anything in the universe is permitted to move. And still, it is not fast enough. Across the span of a mission, The delay in each direction settles somewhere near 12 or 13 minutes. At the moment the two worlds swing closest together, a signal crosses in about 3 minutes. At their farthest separation, on opposite sides of the sun, it can take as long as 22 minutes. A single exchange, one question asked and one answer returned, can consume as much as 44 minutes of a human life. Consider what that actually means. You cannot have a conversation. You can only leave and receive messages, each one a small sealed capsule launched across the void. You say something, and then you wait. You wait longer than it takes to boil water, longer than it takes to walk to the far end of a neighborhood and back. And somewhere in that waiting, the person you spoke to has already lived through minutes you know nothing about. By the time your words arrive, the moment you are speaking into no longer exists. This is not a technical footnote. This is the shape of every relationship the crew will have for nearly 3 years. And here is where the intuition of almost everyone gets the danger wrong. Ask any person what finally breaks a crew sealed together in a metal room for years, and the answer comes quickly. They will tell you it is each other. The cabin fever, the slow grinding of 6 personalities with nowhere to hide, the mutiny that gathers in the dark. We have told this story to ourselves for centuries, in tales of shipwrecks and stranded expeditions and submarines running silent under the ice. We believe, deep down, that human beings pressed too close for too long must eventually turn inward and tear at one another. That belief is wrong. Not entirely wrong, but wrong in the place that matters most. When researchers ran the largest confinement study ever attempted, they did not find the crew turning on itself. They found something stranger, and in some ways sadder. The friction did not gather among the 6 people sharing the air. It gathered along the one thin line that connected them to home. The study was called Mars 500, and it finished in Moscow in November of 2011. 6 volunteers, 3 Russians, 1 Frenchman, 1 Italian, and 1 Chinese crew member, sealed themselves inside a mock spacecraft and stayed there for 520 days. No fresh air, no sunlight, no walking away. Every strain a real Mars crew would face, except the radiation and the gravity, was folded into that sealed box and left to work on them for well over a year. And when the psychologists tallied the conflict, the pattern was unmistakable. Conflicts between the crew and mission control occurred roughly 5 times more often than conflicts among the crew members themselves. Sit with that number for a moment. The people trapped together did not become each other's enemies. They became, if anything, a small closed family. The strain flowed outward, along the delayed and narrowing channel to the world that had sent them. The wound was not the closeness. The wound was the distance. Understanding why requires setting aside the story we thought we knew. The crew turns to one another because they are the only ones who are actually present. They share the same walls, the same recycled air, the same view of the same instruments. When one of them speaks, the others hear it in the instant it is spoken. There is no lag inside the capsule. Inside those walls, human contact still works the way 300,000 years of evolution shaped it to work. It is only the line to Earth that is broken, and a broken line, it turns out, is more corrosive to the human mind than a crowded room. Think about what a delayed message does to an argument. On Earth, a disagreement can be repaired in the space of a breath. You say the wrong thing, you see the other person's face fall, and you correct yourself before the sentence is even finished. That instant loop, speak and see and adjust, is the machinery by which people stay bonded. Now stretch it. You say something, and the reaction does not come back for 20 minutes, and by then you have said 3 more things, and the person on the other end is answering a version of you that no longer exists. Every emergency arrives already old. Every piece of grief, every celebration, every apology reaches its listener minutes after the moment that produced it has passed. You are always talking to the past. You are always being answered by it in return. That is why the crew leans inward and the strain pushes outward. Not because mission control is unkind, and not because the crew is ungrateful, but because the channel between them has been stripped of the one thing that makes human connection feel like connection. It has been stripped of now. A voice you cannot answer in real time slowly stops feeling like a person and starts feeling like a broadcast. And a broadcast, however loving, is a lonely thing to receive. There is another layer folded beneath this one, quieter and easier to miss, and it works on the mind while the mind sleeps. During long stays in space, astronauts do not simply sleep less. The architecture of their sleep is altered. The stage called REM sleep, the phase in which we dream, is cut by roughly half compared to what those same people experienced before they left the ground. And dreaming is not idle theatre. Dreaming is one of the brain's primary tools for processing emotion, for sorting the day's fears and losses and small humiliations and filing them away where they can no longer sting. It is how the mind digests being alive. Now imagine that machinery running at half its strength, not for a single hard week, the way it might after a stressful stretch on Earth, but for years. The emotional residue of each day, the low hum of homesickness, the ache of a message that landed wrong, the slow accumulation of being far away, none of it gets fully cleared overnight. It stays, it layers. The very system that would help a person metabolize the loneliness of that delayed channel is itself running quietly starved. So the distance does not only stretch outward across space, it settles inward, unprocessed, and it deepens with every night of shortened dreaming. And around all of it stands a fact so heavy that most of the crew will train themselves not to think about it directly. There is no coming home early. The orbits of the two worlds do not permit it. A window for the journey between Earth and Mars opens only about once every 26 months. When the planets align in the narrow geometry that makes the crossing possible with the fuel a spacecraft can carry. Miss that window, and the next one is more than 2 years away. Which means that from the moment the crew departs, rescue is not merely difficult. It is not a matter of courage or expense or engineering heroics. It is structurally impossible. If something goes wrong on the way, or on the surface, no ship can be sent in time to matter. Help is not slow. Help is absent, guaranteed absent, for longer than most marriages take to begin. This is the part that reorganizes everything that came before it. Every neurological change, every clock come loose from the day, every darkening of mood, was a private fracture happening inside a single skull. They were the crew's burdens to carry alone, but at least, in theory, someone on the ground could watch, and worry, and coach them through it. What the delay and the launch window reveal is that even that comfort is thinned to almost nothing. The people who love these travelers most, and the mission controllers who have trained beside them for years, are reduced to sending capsules of care into a silence that will not answer for the better part of an hour. Present enough to grieve, too far to help, and the surface stay only lengthens the exposure. The crew does not touch down, plant a flag, and turn for home. In the standard mission plan, they remain on Mars for around 558 days. That is more than a year and a half of waking each morning on a world where the nearest other human beings are the 5 people breathing the same recycled air, and where every other relationship in existence is maintained across that same delayed and lonely channel. 558 days is longer than many people live at any single address on Earth. It is long enough for a child to be born and learn to sit up. It is long enough for the person you left to become, in small, unannounced increments, someone you have not fully met. So the second distance is not the mirror image of the first. The inner fractures were things happening to the crew. This outer distance is a thing happening between the crew and the world, and it is worse in a particular way, because it cannot be healed by anyone's effort or love or vigilance. It is written into the geometry of the solar system itself. You can strengthen a body against radiation, in theory. You can medicate a broken sleep, in part. But you cannot make light travel faster, and you cannot move the planets closer, and you cannot open a launch window before orbital mechanics decides to open it. The crew is not merely far away. They are far away in a manner no human being has ever been far away before, and the mind, which was built for a world of instant faces, has no template for it at all. Consider what this does to the people who carry it. For as long as we have imagined sending humans into the deep dark, the popular fear has fixed itself on a single image. We picture the crew turning against one another. We imagine cabin fever, the slow curdling of trust, the small daily irritations that build until the very people bound together become each other's tormentors. It is the shape of 100 stories, the sealed vessel, the fraying minds, the danger coming from within. But when researchers built the closest thing we have yet made to a genuine Mars mission, the evidence told a different story. Not the story we had rehearsed, a stranger one, and in some ways a lonelier one. In the year 2011, in a windowless facility in Moscow, 6 men sealed themselves inside a mock spacecraft and did not come out for 520 days. The experiment was called Mars 500. 3 of the crew were Russian, 1 was French, 1 was Italian, and 1 was Chinese. They ate the food a real crew would eat. They followed the schedules a real crew would follow. And their messages to the outside world were delayed, stretched artificially to imitate the lag of interplanetary distance. For a year and a half, they lived inside a rehearsal of isolation, so complete that their bodies and minds began to behave as though the isolation were real. Here is what the researchers found. The crew did not come apart against each other, not primarily, not in the way the films had promised. Conflicts between the crew and the people running the mission from outside occurred roughly 5 times more often than conflicts among the crew members themselves. The fracture line did not run between one astronaut and the next. It ran between the sealed world and the world that had sent them. This is the pivot that changes everything. The danger was never really the person floating beside you. The danger was the thread connecting you to home, and the way that threads slowly, invisibly, began to fail. Think about why. On the surface of Mars, a message from Earth does not arrive when it is spoken. It arrives when the light finally reaches you, 12 or 13 minutes later on average, sometimes as much as 22. Every word from home is already old by the time you hear it. Every question you ask hangs in the dark for the better part of half an hour before an answer can return. There is no conversation. There is only the sending of messages into a delay, and the waiting, and the receiving of replies to things you said so long ago you have half forgotten saying them. Consider what that does to comfort. When someone you love is frightened, you want to reach them in the moment of their fear. But there is no such moment on Mars. There is only the echo. If a crew member's child falls ill on Earth, the news of the illness is already old when it arrives, and the words of comfort sent back are already old when they land. And by the time the reassurance reaches the child, the crisis it was meant to soothe may have passed, or worsened into something the astronaut does not yet know about. Not because anyone failed to care, not because the message was neglected, but because the distance itself makes tenderness arrive late, always late, arriving as a report from a past that no longer exists. This is the quiet cruelty the Mars 500 crew felt in miniature. The people who wore on them were not the people breathing the same recycled air. The people who wore on them were the distant voices that could not be argued with in real time, could not be interrupted, could not be reached. You cannot have a real disagreement across a 13-minute gap. You can only transmit your frustration and wait, and the waiting turns ordinary friction into something colder and more permanent. Now stretch that experiment to its true dimensions. A real crew would not spend 520 days in a rehearsal. They would spend 558 days on the actual surface of another planet, longer than most people live at any single address in their entire lives. And every relationship they carried with them would be maintained across that same widening and narrowing gap. Not for a week, not for a month, for the better part of 2 years. Every birthday, every quarrel, every reconciliation, every death would arrive as a recording. The crew would celebrate news that was already old. They would grieve losses that had happened before they knew. They would answer questions that had already stopped mattering to the person who asked them, and layered beneath all of it is a fact the crew can never quite set down. If the thread to Earth is slow, the possibility of rescue is slower still. The planets align for a journey to Mars only once every 26 months, roughly every 2 years and 2 months, because the mathematics of orbits allows no shortcut and grants no exceptions. If something goes wrong on the surface, there is no ship that can be scrambled, no fleet held in reserve, no possibility of arrival before the next window opens more than 2 years away. The crew knows this on the day they leave. They carry it the way you carry a held breath, not as a passing worry, but as a permanent condition of their existence, a knowledge that the only people who can help them are the people already sealed inside the same walls. Here is the part that makes the fracture hardest to heal. Under ordinary conditions, the mind repairs its emotional wounds at night. Dreaming is not idle theatre. It is the brain's primary means of taking the raw material of the day, the fear and the loss and the tension, and filing it into something the waking mind can carry. But in spaceflight, the dreaming itself is suppressed. The deep restorative phase of sleep, the stage in which the brain consolidates its emotional memory, is reduced by roughly half. Not for a single hard night, not for a difficult week, for the entire duration of the mission. So the crew is not only receiving grief late and answering love late, they are doing it with a brain that has been quietly denied its own nightly mechanism for making sense of grief and love at all. The very tools the mind would use to metabolize distance are the tools the mission takes away. The distance widens on the outside, and the instrument that would help you close it wears thin on the inside, and the two failures move in the same direction at the same time. This is why the strangeness does not stay at the surface, it sinks. The delay is not merely an inconvenience of the schedule, it is a slow reshaping of how a human being relates to everyone they have ever loved. Practiced day after day, message after delayed message, until the practice becomes the person. You do not spend 3 years learning to love across a gap and then simply unlearn it on the walk down the ramp. The habit goes deeper than habit. It becomes a new default setting for the heart, a new baseline from which everything else is measured. And the longer we look at that reshaping, the more we begin to suspect something that the mission planners rarely say aloud. The transformation does not end when the ship turns for home. It may only be beginning, because everything we have described so far has been happening to a mind still out there, still under the alien clock, still cut off from the world of instant faces. What happens to that mind when it finally comes back, when the distance collapses and the delay disappears and the world it has been rehearsing from afar is suddenly close enough to touch, is a separate question entirely, and it is a harder one. Consider what the body has been keeping track of all this while. We have followed the mind through its slow reshaping, but the flesh beneath it has been keeping its own quiet ledger, and that ledger does not forgive. Picture a single astronaut standing on the surface of Mars on the 400th sol. Earth is not a world in the sky, it is a pale blue point, smaller than a star, a thing you could hide behind the tip of a raised finger. And every cell in that astronaut's body has been changing in ways that no walk down a landing ramp will undo. We know this because we have already measured it, in miniature, in a single pair of human beings. When the results of NASA's twin study were published in the journal Science, in April of 2019, they revealed something that should have unsettled the world more than it did. Scott Kelly had spent 340 days aboard the International Space Station. His identical twin brother, Mark, had stayed on Earth. 2 men who began life as a single fertilized egg, carrying the same genetic code down to the letter. And after those 340 days, they were no longer the same. About 91.3% of the gene expression changes in Scott's body reverted to their old baseline after he came home. That number sounds reassuring. Read it again. It is not the 91 that matters, it is the fraction that did not come back. A small, stubborn subset of changes, involving the machinery of DNA damage response, the regulation of the telomeres that cap our chromosomes, and the function of the immune system persisted well beyond 6 months. Not for a week, not for the length of a difficult recovery. Beyond 6 months, and in some measures with no clear end in sight. Now hold that figure in your mind and stretch it. Scott Kelly was gone for 340 days. A conjunction-class mission to Mars keeps its crew away for roughly 3 times that long, close to 3 years. We are not talking about a slightly longer version of the same experiment. We are talking about a dose of the unknown administered for nearly 3 years, to a body that has never once, in the entire history of our species, been asked to endure it. This is the disquieting reality of deep time in space. The changes do not simply accumulate. They compound, and they linger, and we do not know where the ceiling is. Not because the science is careless, but because no human being has ever gone far enough to find the ceiling at all. Consider the brain itself, the organ that will have to do the remembering and the loving and the coming home. Magnetic resonance imaging of astronauts after 6-month missions has found microstructural changes in the white matter, the deep wiring that connects one region of the brain to another, on the order of 0.75% to 1.25% across multiple regions. That is roughly twice the rate of change seen in ordinary aging, twice as fast, and only partially reversed at 6 months to a year after landing. The fluid inside the skull shifts too. The free water that bathes the brain redistributes itself by somewhere between 2.5% and 4% across the frontal, temporal, and occipital lobes during spaceflight. The ventricles, the hollow chambers deep within the brain, swell by more than 0.75 milliliter and stay swollen, only creeping back toward normal in the months after return. This is not a metaphor. It is a physical rearrangement of the water in which a human mind is suspended, and it has no parallel anywhere in ordinary life on Earth. Now here is the mathematics that everyday experience hides from us. On Earth, we imagine the body as a thing that heals, that returns, that snaps back to true given enough rest. A broken bone knits, a pulled muscle recovers. We carry an unspoken faith that the flesh is elastic, that damage is temporary, that time is a healer. Space quietly dismantles that faith. It shows us a body that changes twice as fast as aging, that keeps its marks in the genome, that swells and shifts and only partly returns. And it hands us these numbers for a 6-month stay, then falls silent about the longer one, because the data for nearly 3 years simply does not exist. There is a further layer beneath even this, and it is the layer that no shielding can stop. Beyond the protection of Earth's magnetic field, a Mars crew is exposed to galactic cosmic radiation at a rate of roughly 350 millisieverts per year. This is a form of radiation that ordinary shielding cannot stop. It passes straight through the hull, through the walls, through human tissue. We cannot test its effects on people. So, we have tested them on animals. In studies led by Vipan Parihar and his colleagues, published in 2015 and again in 2016, rodents exposed to simulated galactic cosmic radiation showed something haunting. Persistent deficits in the hippocampus, the brain's mapmaker and memory keeper, impairing spatial and recognition memory, impaired executive function in the medial prefrontal cortex, the seat of judgment and restraint, a reduced ability to extinguish fear, and elevated anxiety, lasting 12 to 24 weeks after exposure. Not the duration of the exposure, the duration of the aftermath. Consider what that means, translated into the language of a returning crew. The very faculties we would most want intact in the people we send, the memory, the judgment, the emotional balance, are precisely the faculties the radiation reaches for. And it reaches for them slowly, invisibly, across the whole span of the journey. We should be honest about the limits of this evidence. These are animal models, not human ones. A mouse brain is not a human brain, and the doses and the timelines do not map cleanly from one species to the other. The honest answer is that nobody knows exactly how a human mind weathers 3 years of this exposure. But the direction of the evidence is not comforting, and the absence of certainty is not the same thing as the presence of safety. And there is the body's oldest clock to reckon with, older than any of this, the rhythm of day and night itself. After 558 sols on the Martian surface, each one lasting 24 hours and 39 minutes, a returning astronaut will have lived close to 579 Earth days on an alien schedule. Their internal pacemaker will have spent nearly 3 years being pulled, day after day, toward a rhythm that does not exist on the planet where they were born. Not for a season, not for the length of a bad habit, for years, until the alien rhythm is no longer alien but simply the way time feels. This is the stacking that everyday experience cannot see. Not one system changed, but many, all at once, all in the same body, none of them fully reversing. Not the mind alone, not the brain alone, not the genome alone, not the clock alone. The astronaut who stands on that 400th sol, watching Earth hang small and blue and silent, is being altered in every one of these registers at the same time, and no single measurement captures the whole of it. And there is one more change, quieter than all the rest, because it happens not inside a person, but between people. In 2026, researchers studying Antarctic winter over teams, using wearable sensors to track who spoke to whom, found that the social fabric of an isolated crew does not hold still. Over the long months of isolation, the group fragmented, it split along subgroup lines. Loneliness rose, conflict rose, cohesion fell, quietly, week by week, until the team that emerged from the darkness was not, in its social architecture, the team that had entered it. Consider what that implies for Mars. The crew that lands on Earth may not be the crew that launched, not only because each individual has been reshaped, but because the invisible web of relationships between them has been rewoven into a different pattern. The alliances, the distances, the small daily geometries of who sits beside whom and who trusts whom, all of it drifts across the long isolation, and there is no launch window that can carry the old configuration home. Put all of this together and something becomes visible that no single measurement shows on its own. The body keeps a ledger, and space writes in it in permanent ink. Every system has its own entry, the genome with its stubborn unreverted lines, the white matter aging at double speed, the ventricles swollen and slow to shrink, the hippocampus quietly worn by radiation the walls cannot keep out, the circadian clock retuned to a foreign day, and the ledger has no bottom line, because the accounting has never been allowed to finish. Every figure we possess was gathered at 6 months, or 10 months, or a year. The Mars figure is a blank page. If you could stand the returning astronaut beside a perfect copy of themselves, a version who had stayed behind and lived an ordinary 3 years on Earth, you would not at first glance see the difference. 2 faces, the same. 2 voices, the same. But the difference would be written underneath, in the telomeres and the white matter and the immune cells and the buried rhythm of sleep. It would be the same difference the twin study found between Scott and Mark Kelly, only larger, spread across nearly 3 times the span. 2 identical people, no longer identical. Not in what they remember, though that too. Not in how they feel, though that too. But in the quiet chemistry of the cells themselves. This is the deepening that the mission architecture cannot design around. You can soften the lighting to ease the clock, though never fully. You can screen and train and select the calmest, most resilient crew that humanity can produce. And still the ledger fills, line by line, soul by soul, because the changes are not a failure of the machine or the crew. They are the price of the distance itself. The body does not know it is on a mission. It only knows that it is somewhere it was never built to be. Consider the arithmetic of the clock, because the clock hides one of the strangest debts of all. 558 Martian sols do not add up to 558 Earth days. Each sol runs about 24 hours and 37 to 39 minutes long, and those extra minutes do not vanish. they accumulate. By the time the surface stay is over, the crew will have lived closer to 579 Earth-equivalent days on that alien rhythm, nearly 3 additional weeks that no calendar back home ever recorded. It is a debt paid a few minutes at a time and collected in weeks, borrowed silently from a planet that simply turns more slowly than the one they were born on. The human circadian pacemaker, left to run on its own in darkness, keeps a day of about 24 hours and 11 minutes. The Martian soul keeps a day of about 24 hours and 39. Those two numbers look almost identical. They are not. They are close enough that the body keeps trying to lock onto Mars, and far enough apart that it never can, drifting a little further out of phase with every rotation. This is the mathematics that everyday experience hides completely, because on Earth the sun corrects us before we ever notice the drift. On Mars there is no such correction. There is only the slow, patient slippage of an internal clock that cannot find its anchor. Now hold the recovery data up against the length of the journey, and watch where the numbers run out. The white matter changes, the ventricular expansion, the cerebrospinal fluid pushed into regions it was never meant to occupy. Every one of those measurements came from missions of roughly 6 months, and every one of them recovered only partway, 6 months to a year after the astronaut came home. Not fully, partway. The brain kept some of what space had done to it, and gave back the rest slowly, if at all. Then ask the only question that matters for Mars, and notice that no one can answer it. What happens after nearly 3 years? There is no data for 3 years, not for 2 years, not for 18 months, not for a single day beyond the roughly 1 year that the longest continuous human missions have ever recorded. The graph of recovery does not bend downward at the far end. It simply stops, because no human has ever been out there long enough to draw the rest of the line. The Mars crew will be the first points plotted in that empty space, and the shape of the curve they trace is unknown to everyone, including them. This is the deepening that no simulation on Earth can reach, because time itself is the variable that cannot be faked. The twin study followed Scott Kelly for 340 days, and 6 months after he landed, a small set of changes had still not returned to baseline. Changes in how his cells repaired their own damaged DNA, changes in the machinery that protects the ends of his chromosomes, changes in how his immune system read its own instructions. That was 340 days. A Mars mission runs nearly 3 times as long, roughly 1,005 days from launch to landing. Whatever fraction of those changes proved permanent after 1 year, no one can say what fraction proves permanent after 3. And the divergence is not only written inside the body, it is written between the bodies, in the shape of the group itself. Wearable sensors worn by Antarctic winter over teams, in research published in 2026, recorded something quieter and stranger than open conflict. Over the long months of isolation, the group did not simply grow closer, and it did not simply grow apart. It fractured along seams. Social interaction fragmented into smaller subgroups, loneliness rose, conflict rose, and the sense of the team as a single whole slowly fell away. The people who eventually left that ice were, as a social organism, no longer the people who had arrived. Consider what that means for a crew sealed together for nearly 3 years. It means the transformation is not only something each astronaut carries privately in their own tissue, it is something the crew undergoes together, as a unit, the invisible web of who trusts whom, and who speaks to whom quietly rearranging itself, soul after soul. The crew that lands may not be the crew that departed. Not in their faces, which are the same, not in their names, which are the same, but in their architecture, in the pattern of bonds that hold several people into one team. That pattern can shift without anyone deciding to shift it, the way a river finds a new channel without any single drop choosing the path. Layer these facts on top of one another, and the full weight of the deepening arrives. A brain aging at roughly twice the ordinary rate, in the specific regions that govern balance, motion, and the body's sense of where it is in space. A skull carrying more fluid in it than it left with. a genome still expressing itself differently months after return in the systems that guard against damage and disease. A clock calibrated to a day that Earth does not keep, a radiation dose of about 350 millisieverts a year passing straight through the shielding and into the hippocampus, the seat of memory itself, and a social fabric quietly reweaving itself in the dark. Not one of these changes alone would make a stranger. Together, compounding across 1,000 days, they might make several. And here is the part that everyday intuition refuses to hold. None of it feels like damage from the inside. The astronaut on the surface, standing in the rust-colored dust with Earth reduced to a single pale point of light in a black sky, does not feel their white matter thinning, or their telomeres shifting, or their circadian clock sliding out of phase. They feel fine. They feel like themselves. The changes are silent by design, because the body has no sense organ for its own slow rewriting. It cannot feel the ledger filling. It can only feel the present moment, on a world where the present moment is the only thing that has ever existed for a human being. That is the cruelty hidden in the physics. The transformation does not announce itself. It does not arrive as pain or as illness, or as any signal the astronaut could point to and name. It arrives as accumulation, soul by soul, sievert by sievert, minute of drift by minute of drift, each increment far too small to notice, and the sum far too large to reverse. By the time anyone could measure it clearly, the crew would already be home, already among the people they left, already being looked at by eyes that remember who they used to be. And the measurement would come too late to matter, because the distance has already been crossed, and the price has already been paid, quietly, in a currency the body spends without ever being asked. And that is the state in which they will finally come home. Not broken, not visibly wounded, not carrying any mark a camera could find, just quietly, structurally, permanently different, in 100 small ways that no one waiting on the landing pad will be able to see, and that the returning crew themselves will not be able to feel until the moment they are asked to step back into a life that kept moving without them. A life that kept moving without them. That final phrase is the whole of what remains to be said, and it is the layer beneath every other layer, the one that no engineering review can plan for and no medical scan can measure. Everything described until now has happened inside the crew. In tissue, in gene expression, in the slow drift of a body clock, and the quiet redrawing of white matter. But this last transformation is not internal at all. This one happens in the space between two people. It happens when the person who was changed by the journey is finally set down in front of the people who were not, and both of them are asked, without anyone saying it aloud, to behave as though nothing has moved. Consider the moment of first physical contact. The ship settles. The hatch opens after nearly 3 years of being sealed against the vacuum, and the crew is lifted out into gravity, into wind, into unfiltered daylight, and into the arms of people who have waited the entire time. This is supposed to be the reward. This is the image every mission poster promises, and yet it is also the first collision, the moment the returning body discovers that it no longer belongs to the world it is being handed back to. Scott Kelly described his own version of this after only 340 days aboard the International Space Station. On his third step through his own front door, he stumbled sideways into a planter. Not because he was clumsy, not because he was tired, but because his vestibular system, the inner architecture of balance, was still trying to negotiate with a gravity it had forgotten how to trust. Now stretch that single stumble across a mission 3 times longer. The crew returning from Mars will have spent roughly 1,005 days away, nearly 2.8 years, and their brains will have been remodeling the entire time. Recall what the imaging showed. White matter shifting at roughly twice the rate of normal aging. Ventricles swelling by more than 3/4 of a milliliter. The superior longitudinal fasciculus. The corticospinal tract. The cerebellar peduncles, all of the machinery that tells a person where their limbs are and how the ground is tilting, quietly rewired by weightlessness, and then handed, without warning, a full planet's worth of pull. The first step off the ship is not a homecoming for that machinery. It is an interrogation, and the body answers slowly, if it answers at all. Then there is the sound. For the entire mission, every voice from Earth arrived late. At closest approach, the delay was around 3 minutes. At the far side of the sun, it stretched to 22. Across the average of the mission, roughly 12 or 13 minutes each way, so that a single question and its answer could take the better part of an hour to complete. The crew will have spent years learning to speak into that gap, to send words the way you drop a stone into a deep well and wait for the distant sound of it landing. They will have stopped expecting replies. They will have built an entire emotional grammar around delay. And then, on landing day, a voice will reach them instantly. Not because the words are different, but because they arrive with no distance inside them at all. A greeting, spoken from 2 feet away, answered in the same breath. To anyone else, this is the most ordinary thing in the world. To a returning Mars crew, it may be the strangest sound they have heard in 3 years. An intimacy so immediate it feels almost like an intrusion. A closeness the nervous system has been trained to consider impossible. This is where the deepest irony of the whole journey reveals itself. Jessica Meir came home from a 7-month stay aboard the space station in April of 2020, arriving into a planet that had locked itself down against a pandemic. Before she landed, she said something that should sit uneasily with anyone who imagines that coming home is the easy part. She said she expected to feel more isolated on Earth than she had in orbit. She explained why. In space, she said, isolation is the natural state of things, the condition the whole environment is built around. On Earth it is not. Society is not constructed for it. And so returning to a world that suddenly demanded distance felt, to her, harder to bear than the distance of space itself. The lesson beneath her words applies to Mars with terrible force. The crew will not struggle because Earth is cold to them. They will struggle because Earth is warm in a way their nervous systems have spent years unlearning, and there is no medication and no protocol for teaching a person how to be surrounded again, and the people surrounding them will have moved. This is the part that no shielding stops and no exercise regimen reverses. Over 1,005 days, lives on Earth do not pause out of loyalty. Children who were toddlers at launch, barely able to form the word goodbye, will be walking into classrooms by the time the ship returns, holding whole vocabularies and whole opinions and whole interior lives the astronaut never watched assemble. Relationships will have deepened, or quietly dissolved, or transformed into something unrecognizable, and every one of those changes will have happened without the traveler present to absorb it gradually. Scott Kelly wrote, after only his 340 days, that he had learned his daughters were remarkable and resilient, and that he had missed a piece of each of their lives that he could never get back. He wrote that about a mission 1/3 the length of Mars. Multiply the absence. Multiply the missed pieces. The Mars crew will not return to their families. They will return to the strangers those families have quietly become, and to the strangers they have quietly become in return. History has already run this experiment once, in a form no one intended. Sergei Krikalev launched to the space station Mir in May of 1991, wearing the flag of the Soviet Union. While he orbited, the country beneath him came apart. He landed in March of 1992 into a nation that no longer existed, still wearing the emblem of a vanished state. His home city of Leningrad had been renamed St. Petersburg while he was overhead, unable to touch it, unable to slow it, unable to do anything but watch the map rewrite itself through a small window. He did not change. The world changed, and the gap between the two was something no debriefing could close. A Mars crew faces both halves of that gap at once. They will be different, and the world will be different, and the two differences will not have been synchronized by any shared experience, because for nearly 3 years there was no shared experience to be had. This is the quiet devastation the twin study first made visible. 2 human beings, Scott and Mark Kelly, genetically identical down to the smallest sequence, were separated for 340 days, one in orbit and one on the ground. When they were compared afterward, they were measurably no longer the same. Most of the changes reverted. Around 91.3% of the altered gene expression returned toward baseline within months, but a fraction did not. The fraction touching DNA repair, telomere regulation, and immune function, and that fraction persisted past 6 months, with no clear promise of ever fully closing. That was 1 year apart. The Mars mission is nearly 3 times as long. Whatever divergence 340 days can open between two identical people, the honest answer is that nobody knows what 1005 days will open, because no two humans have ever been separated that way and then set side by side to be measured. And here, finally, is the small light that the final layer allows. Though it comes wrapped in its own new shadow, the body does try to come back. The imaging studies that found swollen ventricles and shifted white matter after 6-month missions also found something gentler at the follow-up. Partial recovery. Some of the fluid returning toward where it belonged, some of the structure easing back at 6 months and 12 months after landing. The brain is not only capable of being changed, it is capable, at least in part, of changing back. That is the hope, and it is real, and it should not be dismissed. But notice the words that qualify it. Partial. 6-month missions. Follow-up at 6 to 12 months. Every recovery curve we possess was measured on journeys a fraction the length of Mars, and every one of them showed the return as incomplete. What the curve looks like after nearly 3 years, whether it bends back toward baseline or flattens into a new permanent floor, is a question with no data behind it at all. We are hoping along a line that has never been drawn. The people who study Earth's harshest isolation already suspect where that line may lead. Those who winter over in Antarctica, in the closest analogue we have to a crew sealed away from the world, do not simply walk back into ordinary life when the season ends. Some of them report a lasting difficulty afterward, a trouble tolerating crowds, a rawness to noise, a body that flinches from the ordinary pace of human interaction that once felt like nothing. They were only gone for a winter. They only crossed a continent. The Mars crew will have crossed the space between planets and lived on the far side of a communication gap that made every voice arrive already old. If a single Antarctic season can leave a person unable to bear a crowded room, the honest question is not whether the Mars crew comes home changed. That much is already settled. The question is what remains once the changing stops, and whether the word home can still mean anything to a nervous system that spent 1005 days learning to live without it. There is a precedent for this, though it comes from a place no planner expected to find one. Consider the case of Sergei Krikalev. In May of 1991, this Soviet cosmonaut launched toward the space station Mir, wearing the insignia of a nation called the Soviet Union, expecting to be gone a matter of months. While he orbited, something happened that no mission had ever prepared a human being to survive. The country beneath him dissolved. The Soviet Union collapsed while he was in space, its flag lowered, its borders redrawn, its certainties quietly erased. When he finally came down in March of 1992, he landed as a citizen of a country that no longer existed. His home city of Leningrad had been renamed St. Petersburg. He had left one world and returned to another, and he had never moved from his orbit at all, not because he had changed, because everything he left behind had changed without him. That is the quiet horror hidden inside the Mars problem, and it has nothing to do with radiation or bone loss, or the folded architecture of the brain. It is the horror of asymmetry. Earth does not pause for the people who leave it. The Mars crew will be gone for 1005 days. In that span, children small enough to carry at the launch pad will have learned to read. Friends will have married, or divorced, or moved to cities the astronaut has never seen. Parents will have aged in ways that photographs soften and time does not. The astronaut experiences the separation as one continuous absence. a single held breath nearly 3 years long. Everyone on Earth experiences it as 1,000 small departures, a slow accumulation of ordinary days lived without them. These are not the same experience. They cannot be reconciled by any message, however loving, sent across a gap of 12 or 13 minutes. Scott Kelly understood this better than most. He spent 340 days aboard the International Space Station, and when he wrote about what that year had cost him, he did not write about muscle or bone. He wrote about his daughters. He said he had learned that they were remarkable and resilient people, and that he had missed a piece of each of their lives that he could never get back. Not a piece he could recover later, not a piece that waited for him. A piece that was simply gone, closed over, lived without him. And his mission was less than 1/3 the length of a journey to Mars. Consider what this means for the moment of return itself, the instant that should be pure joy and may instead be something far stranger. For nearly 3 years, the Mars crew will have known human connection only as delay. Every voice from Earth arrives already old, recorded, unanswerable in the moment it is heard. Even at the closest approach of the two planets, when Mars and Earth swing nearest along their orbits, a signal still takes 3 minutes to cross the emptiness between them. A conversation, in the way you and I understand the word, becomes impossible. There is only the sending, and the waiting, and the receiving, each separated by minutes that cannot be closed. Now imagine the first real conversation after landing. A voice that answers instantly. A reply that arrives the very moment the words leave your mouth, with no lag, no pause, no interval in which to brace yourself. For most of us, this is simply the ordinary texture of being alive. For someone who has spent 1,005 days speaking into a delay, the sudden immediacy of another person answering in real time may feel less like relief and more like a kind of shock. The nervous system had adapted to the gap. The gap had become the shape of connection itself. And now, all at once, the gap is gone. Jessica Meir returned from 7 months aboard the station in April of 2020, descending into a planet locked down by a pandemic, a world transformed while she circled above it. She said something that should stay with anyone who imagines the danger of a Mars mission ends at the landing. She said she thought she would actually feel more isolated on Earth than she had felt in space. On Earth, she explained, you are not built for isolation. Society is not constructed for it. The loneliness of return, she suggested, could be harder to carry than the loneliness of the mission itself. Precisely because down here, you are surrounded by a world that expects you to already be part of it again. Not because return is lonelier in some measurable way, but because return demands a belonging the astronaut can no longer perform. Beneath all of it, quieter than any of it, the body keeps its own record of the separation. The twin study proved that 2 human beings who began as a single fertilized cell, genetically identical down to the last letter, will diverge in measurable ways after only 340 days apart, one in orbit and one on the ground. Their genes express themselves differently, their cells age differently. The vast majority of those differences reversed after return, but not all of them. Some persisted past 6 months, written into the machinery of DNA repair and immune response, and the fragile caps at the ends of the chromosomes. That divergence was measured across less than a single year, between 2 people who had shared everything. The Mars crew will diverge from the people they left across nearly 3 times that span. We do not know how much of that divergence reverses. We do not know the recovery curve, because no human recovery curve has ever been drawn from a distance this great. The astronauts who spent 6 months in orbit regained only part of what had shifted inside their brains, and only after 6 to 12 months back on the ground. For a mission of 1,005 days, there is no ceiling data, no baseline, no reassuring precedent that promises the changing eventually stops. There may be a threshold beyond which some part of what the journey rewrote simply stays rewritten. Not damaged necessarily, not broken, just permanently, quietly other. So all of it converges here, in this single unresolved wait, The delay that made every voice arrive already old. The altered sleep, the redistributed fluid, the white matter aging at twice its ordinary pace. The isolation that a winter in Antarctica already tells us can outlast the isolation itself. The slow biological drift between two people who were once the same cell. Each of these is a small stranger making, and the mission stacks them one atop another across nearly 3 years. The person who steps off that ship will carry all of it in a body and a mind that no one on Earth shared, and that raises a question far larger than Mars, far larger than physics, a question about what a self even is, and whether the one that returns can honestly be called the one that left. That question is not new, it is only newly literal. For most of human history, a person could wonder whether they were still themselves after some great passage, and the wondering stayed soft, a matter of memory and mood and the stories they told about their own life. The change could be felt, but never weighed. Now, the change can be weighed. It sits inside a brain scan. It shows in the quiet arithmetic of which genes are switched on and which have gone silent. This is the strange gift and the strange burden of what we have learned. The stranger who steps off the ship is not a metaphor, not a feeling the traveller might talk themselves out of on a good day, but a body and a mind measurably displaced from the ones that left. Consider what the twins' study already proved with only 340 days. 2 human beings who began as a single cell, identical down to the smallest instruction, were pulled apart by less than a year of separation, one in orbit and one on the ground. When they were compared again, 91.3% of the changes had reverted. The traveller had mostly come home to himself, but not entirely. Some fractions stayed rewritten, and a Mars crew would be gone not for 340 days, but for 1,005, nearly 3 times as long, across a gap no rescue could ever cross. Whatever small permanent divergence a single year can carve, we have no reason to believe 3 years would carve less. And yet the person is only half of the equation. The other half is the world they return to, because the world does not hold still while the traveller is gone. There is a man who understood this more completely than perhaps anyone who has ever lived. In May of 1991, a cosmonaut named Sergei Krikalev launched to the Mir space station as a citizen of the Soviet Union. He wore the flag of that nation on his suit. He left behind a country, a government, a city, a set of certainties about who he was and where he belonged. While he orbited above it, that country came apart beneath him. The Soviet Union dissolved. When he finally returned to the ground in March of 1992, he wore on his shoulder the flag of a nation that no longer existed. His own city had been renamed while he was away. He had left from Leningrad. He came back to St. Petersburg. Same streets, same river. A different name arranged around a man who had not moved through any of that history, but simply fallen back into it from the sky. This is the second half of the stranger making, and it is the half the science of the body cannot measure. Not only does the traveller change, the home changes too, and a Mars mission stretches this doubling to a length no human has yet endured. 1,005 days is long enough for children to cross from one stage of life into another, long enough for friendships to cool, for parents to age, for a neighbourhood to be rebuilt, for the small daily language of a family to drift into references the returning astronaut will not recognise, not because anyone forgot them, but because life on Earth is a river that does not pause for anyone who steps out of it, not even for someone who stepped out to walk on another planet. So we arrive at the tension, and it is a tension that does not resolve, because both of its halves are true at once. Perhaps the person who returns is not diminished at all. Perhaps they are enlarged. There is a documented shift that astronauts describe when they look back at the Earth from far enough away, a phenomenon the space philosopher Frank White named the overview effect. In that moment, something in the sense of self loosens. National borders vanish. The old boundaries of identity soften and thin. Astronauts describe a feeling of unity with all of humanity, a reduced sense of their own separateness, a permanent deepening of how much they care about the fragile world below them. If that is what the distance does, then the stranger who comes home is not a loss but a widening. Not a person subtracted from, but a person expanded past the edges of who they were. Or perhaps the widening is precisely the wound. Perhaps a self that has loosened its borders is a self that no longer fits the narrow, warm, particular life it left behind. The overview effect dissolves the small identities, but it is the small identities that let a person sit at a familiar kitchen table and feel that they belong there. To be unified with all of humanity is a magnificent thing to feel from orbit. It may be a very lonely thing to carry back into a specific house, on a specific street, among specific people who only ever asked the traveller to be the person they remembered. Not larger, not transformed by cosmic perspective, but simply present and ordinary and theirs. There is no instrument that settles which of these is the truer account. The measurements can tell us the white matter aged, the fluid shifted, the genes changed and mostly changed back. They cannot tell us whether the human being who houses all of that is richer or poorer for the passage. That is not a question physics is equipped to answer. It is not a question anyone but the traveller can answer, and even the traveller may spend the rest of their life unsure. And so the question has to be handed back. These are not problems with universal solutions. They are not equations with a single value waiting at the end. Different people will weigh them differently, and each will be right for their own life. Some will decide that to have walked on another world, to have carried the human story across that gap and brought it home again, would justify any private cost, any distance opened between themselves and the people they love. For them, the changed self is a fair price, gladly paid. Others will decide the opposite, that no view of the earth from millions of miles away could ever be worth arriving home a stranger to your own children. That belonging matters more than magnificence, and that the deepest human need is not to transcend the small warm life, but to remain inside it. Both of those people would be telling the truth. Not a partial truth, not a truth that cancels the other, but two whole answers to a question the universe leaves genuinely open. And the strangest part is that the mission itself does not care which answer is correct. It does not require anyone to fail, or to be weak, or to make a single mistake. The stranger making is not a risk to be engineered away with better shielding or a cleverer schedule. It is written into the architecture itself, into the orbital mechanics that open a launch window only once every 26 months. Into the distance that stretches a spoken word to 22 minutes of travel. Into the 1005 days that physics, not human frailty, demands as the price of the passage. The people who return are not the people who left, because the shape of the solar system will not permit it to be otherwise. Consider what that means, and how rare it is. Almost every hardship humans have ever faced could in principle be avoided, softened or outlasted. We build walls against the cold. We store food against the famine. We send help across the sea when a distant place suffers. But there is no wall against the gap between two planets. There is no help that can cross it in time. The delay cannot be shortened by any effort of will, because it is only light, moving as fast as anything in the universe is allowed to move, and still taking those long minutes to arrive. The isolation cannot be broken early, because the next window will not open until the planets themselves have swung back into alignment. For the length of the mission, the crew live inside a fact that no amount of courage can soften. They are as far from rescue as human beings have ever been, held there not by any enemy, but by the calm indifference of orbital geometry. And when you widen the view far enough, that indifference is the whole story of where we live. The same physics that separates Mars from Earth by minutes of light is the physics that separates every world from every other world in a universe that was never arranged for human convenience. The distances are not cruel, they are not kind. They simply are, laid down long before anyone was here to be inconvenienced by them, and they will remain long after. A Mars mission is the first time human beings will press their own soft, sleep-needing, memory-keeping bodies against that indifference at full scale, and stay there long enough to be changed by the pressing. Not for an afternoon, not for the length of a single orbit, but for nearly 3 years, on the far side of a distance that answers no prayer and grants no exception. This is the deeper thing the title was always pointing toward. The strangeness of the returning astronaut is not really a story about Mars. It is a story about what happens when a creature evolved for one small warm planet steps far enough outside it to feel the size of everything else. We were shaped by a single day of 24 hours, by a single sky, by faces close enough to touch, and voices that answer in the same breath. Take a person out of all of that, hold them in the silence and the delay and the altered light for 1,000 days, and they do not simply travel through space. They cross some quieter threshold inside themselves, and part of the crossing does not reverse, not because the journey broke them, but because the journey showed them a scale of things the human animal was never built to hold, and no one holds that and comes back entirely unmarked. So before we ask whether such a person could ever truly come home, it is worth sitting for a moment inside the full size of the place they travelled into. Perhaps this is simply the cost, and it is a cost worth paying. Perhaps a species that reaches another world earns the right to be changed by the reaching. Perhaps the strangeness of the ones who return is not a wound at all, but a kind of evidence, quiet proof that they truly went somewhere, that the distance was real and they crossed it. Or perhaps something essential is lost in that crossing, something no achievement can ever repay, a small human wholeness that depends on never being quite that far from every other person alive. These questions have no settled answers. Different people will weigh them differently, and both answers can be honest in the same breath. The astronaut who returns and the family who waited through 1,000 days will each decide, privately and without instruction, whether the silence was worth what it took from them. And you may decide too, lying here in the dark, whether you would ever choose to go, knowing what the going does. Consider, one last time, how little separates us from all of it. The twin study showed that 2 genetically identical people, apart for 340 days, came home measurably different in the quiet machinery of their cells. Roughly 91% of those changes reversed. Not all of them. Now stretch that gap to 1,000 days, across a void so wide that a single spoken word needs as long as 44 minutes to leave your mouth and return as an answer. And the divergence is no longer a curiosity. It becomes a certainty, written not into any human weakness but into the cold arithmetic of the orbits themselves. And, still, they will go, not because the universe calls them, because it does not. It is indifferent to whether we ever leave this small warm world, indifferent to whether we stay or vanish entirely. The dark between the planets does not know our names and never will, but something in us has always answered that silence by moving toward it, generation after generation, reaching past the edge of the map because the edge was there. It is the oldest instinct we have, older than history, older than language, and no arithmetic of loss has ever managed to talk it out of us. The people who make that particular crossing will come back altered. Their sleep will be wrong for a while. Their balance will betray them on the first step. Their sense of time, of nearness, of what a conversation is supposed to feel like, may never fully settle back into the shape it held before. They will be strangers to the people who loved them, and stranger still to themselves. And yet they will also be the first of us to have stood on another ground and looked back at this one as a single pale point of light. They will carry that inside them for the rest of their lives, and through them, in some small and permanent way, the rest of us will have gone too. Every person who ever looked up and wondered will have a thread, however thin, running all the way to the surface of Mars. That is the trade the universe offers. Distance for wonder, belonging for vastness, a home you can never quite return to, in exchange for having touched a place no ancestor ever dreamed you could reach. They will never again be entirely who they were, and yet they will be something no human has ever been, and that will be ours.